We shall fight on beaches, landing grounds, in fields, in streets, and on the hills. We shall never surrender.
For anyone who lived through the Second World War, June the 6th, 1944, emblazoned in history as D-Day, will never be forgotten. It was the beginning of the war's end, and as the Allied forces landed in France on the occupied beaches of Normandy, the tide of history was turning against the tyranny of Adolf Hitler. Today, many thousands of visitors to this beautiful region of France walk in the footsteps of the brave men who gave their lives to liberate this now tranquil landscape. Like many people who come here, retired RAF squadron leader Colin Pomeroy has a very special reason for searching out the D-Day landing sites. His father, then serving with the 1st Battalion of the Dorset Regiment, was one of the soldiers heading the assault force fighting their way up this very beach, codenamed Gold, on that windswept June day so long ago. Returning some years later, father and son were able to share a moving experience, and it is a pilgrimage that Colin has made on a regular basis ever since. As a military historian, the D-Day landings are of particular interest to Colin, making him an ideal guide for this programme. But but the fact that he also has such a personal connection with his subject is most definitely an added bonus. When you first encounter the beaches of Normandy, it's hard to imagine the sheltered expanses of golden sand as anything but perfectly peaceful. Known as the Côte de Nacre, which translates as the Mother of Pearl Coast, there's a timeless beauty lingering here that makes it beyond belief that the bloody battles of the D-Day landings took place along this shoreline. However, before setting out on this incredible journey to visit the most significant locations, we do need to pause and enjoy the magnificent view as we set the scene. In the early part of 1944, even Adolf Hitler knew that the invasion of France by the Allied forces was imminent. The fact, therefore, that the D-Day landings took the German commanders somewhat by surprise speaks volumes for the skills of Allied counterintelligence. Choosing the Normandy beaches was a stroke of genius. Hitler had anticipated that the attack would come from the Kent coast to Calais, and the Allies cleverly reinforced this theory. For every reconnaissance flight over Normandy, 2 were flown over the Pas de Calais. The idea that a long-distance sea crossing would be preferable over the shortest hop across to France was preposterous. The weather that June was unseasonably stormy, and an invasion was ruled out by the Germans so emphatically that Field Marshal Edwin Rommel, the man charged with preparing for the expected onslaught, left France to return home to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday. On the 1st and 5th of June, coded messages were broadcast on the BBC to let the French resistance know that the invasion force was on its way. The lines, "The long sobs of the violins of autumn," and "Wound my heart with a monotonous languor" were used, and although the chief of German intelligence had been tipped off as to the significance of these words, Rommel's staff dismissed the broadcasts because they refused to believe that the Allies would announce their intentions over the radio. However, the German commanders were quite right in one respect. The weather was dreadful. Who in their right minds would contemplate an assault on France in such conditions? For the Allies, preparing for Operation Overlord, as the invasion plan was codenamed, had always been dependent on the meteorological reports. Tide patterns and the state of the moon could at least be predicted, and June the 5th looked ideal. But when the weather turned stormy, the Commander-in-Chief of the Allied Expeditionary Force, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, reluctantly decided to postpone. The next day was little better, and it was a tough call to make. If not the 6th of June, then it would be at least a fortnight before another attempt could be made. Would the preparations continue to be kept secret? What should happen to the thousands of men already aboard ship? Could they be disembarked, and if so, where to? If ever the cliché "between a rock and a hard place" applied, it was here. It was a risky business indeed, but to all those involved, it was a chance worth taking. And within 2 hours of Eisenhower giving the command, the D-Day invasion convoys slipped silently out into the stormy sea. Our first destination on this tour actually takes us inland to the town of Benneville, at the eastern end of the D-Day beaches. Although we're oversimplifying, the first duties of Operation Overlord called for an airborne attack to secure the rear of the beachheads and neutralise as much of the ordnance targeted on the shoreline as possible. At the eastern end of the designated landing zone lay Caen, which was under heavy German occupation. North of this city there were two strategically important bridges crossing the Caen Canal and the River Orne respectively. It was the task of the British 6th Airborne Division to capture these bridges and preserve them intact, as they would be critical to the eventual breakout from the beachhead. Ever since D-Day, this has been popularly known as Pegasus Bridge, because of the proud flying horse insignia of the British airborne forces who won the first victory of the Normandy campaign. Wooden hawser gliders were towed across the channel by Halifax bomber tugs, and when on target were unhitched to descend silently into the blacked-out French countryside. Although the ground is waterlogged today, when the gliders landed here to set D-Day in motion, this was just an ordinary field. The three lectern-like memorials mark the points where Major John Howard's gliders landed perfectly on target, enabling a swift capture of Pegasus Bridge, with the element of surprise definitely a bonus for the British soldiers. For those who come to visit Pegasus Bridge today, it's been rather a contentious issue that this is not the wartime original. As the 50th anniversary of the D-Day landings drew near, the Caen authorities announced their intention to replace the bridge. Furious protests followed, as for so many veterans, Pegasus Bridge was a lasting symbol of the bravery and sacrifice made by so many to liberate France and defeat Adolf Hitler. Nevertheless, the bullet-marked original was dismantled in November 1993, with completion of the new bridge in April 94. Fortunately, the design of the bridge is pretty much identical to the old one. It's just a little wider, and so you do get a fairly accurate idea of how this place would have looked in June 1944. While here, it's well worth searching out the Pegasus Bridge Café, which was in fact the first building in France to be liberated from German occupation. A family concern, the Café Gondré, had its own way of coping with the invading Germans. Georges Gondré buried 99 bottles of champagne in the garden, rather than have it consumed by the enemy, but immediately dug it up to celebrate the arrival of the Allied forces. The café quickly became a veritable home from home for thousands of ex-servicemen, with the grateful host continuing to offer them free champagne. It's sad that although the café has remained in family ownership, a modern-day feud between the surviving relatives has resulted in periods of enforced closure. But things are looking positive at the moment for this remarkable building and all the memories it holds of June 1944. Now, just as the British troops were landing on the eastern edge of the Normandy beaches, the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions set off from southern England to secure the northwestern perimeter to prevent the German army counterattacking. The weather, as we've already established, was far from ideal, and with poor visibility and high winds, the paratroopers landed as much as 25 miles off course. Field Marshal Rommel had taken measures all across France to flood areas suitable for parachute landings, and also, more famously, he laced entire stretches of land with explosive stakes, the dreaded Rommel asparagus. Carrying heavy packs and ammunition ready to attack the defending Germans, many of the off-course airmen drowned where they fell, swamped under the weight of their own kit. This is the charming town of Saint-Mère-Église, where Private John Steele, one of the 13,000 men to drop from the skies in the early hours of D-Day, gained lasting fame. The fine church steeple caught the drifting paratrooper, trapping him to dangle helplessly. For 2 long hours, the resourceful man feigned death, but eventually the Germans captured him. It's a story that was immortalised in the 1960s film The Longest Day. And take a closer look at this church when you visit, because a paratrooper still hangs from this famous church spire. But don't be alarmed, it's only a dummy. There are quite a few shops selling plastic replicas for anyone who's interested. The stained glass windows of the church are worthy of note, poignantly depicting scenes from the D-Day landings. Here, the Virgin Mary is surrounded by paratroopers, commemorating the events of June 1944 in a most original and vivid way. From Saint-Mère-Église, it's just a short distance to the first of the beaches we'll be visiting on this tour. Following hot on the heels of the American Airborne Divisions, by 2 a.m. on June the 6th, 30,000 American troops and 3,500 vehicles were in position, ready to land here on Utah Beach with the first light of day. The sea was rough, and nausea caused by the high-rolling waves took its toll. However, the bad weather did have its advantages, as the German E-boats that had been sent out from Cherbourg to patrol this particular area of coastline turned back to port. Preparations had been thorough. Nighttime Allied bombing raids had hammered the coastal batteries under the cover of darkness. At about 5:20 a.m, 300 medium bombers of the 9th US Air Force flew below cloud level to strike the gun emplacements along Utah Beach, whilst shell fire from strategically placed battleships, cruisers and destroyers reinforced the attack from the sea. Consequently, when the assault craft loaded with 2 battalions of the 4th US Infantry Division landed, there was little resistance. 2 D-Day tank squadrons quickly followed, and by 6:30 a.m, progress over the exposed beach to the relative safety of a long, low line of dunes went unhindered, with the exception of fitful spurts of enemy gunfire. The figures from Utah were excellent. There were only 197 Allied casualties, and of the 32 precious tanks to be sent ashore, only 4 were lost. The ease of the Utah landing was due in part to a fortunate navigation error that brought the troops in nearly a mile south of their designated target area. Today, the Leclerc Memorial marks where the US infantry should have landed, and it's well worth stopping off here to investigate the blockhouses and bunkers that fortified this section of beach in 1944, heavily armed and well manned in anticipation of the Allied invasion. However, at the spot where the Americans actually did come ashore, only a single battalion of German soldiers were in a position to defend, and there was little they could do to halt the advancing Allies. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, the former president's eldest son, was in command at Utah, and upon realizing the mistake, is credited with calmly remarking, "We'll start the war from here." There are a striking number of D-Day monuments at this historic beach location, including the milestone marker 00, denoting the beginning of the 4th Division's Liberty Highway, which runs all the way to the German border. Each kilometre of the hard-fought distance is commemorated with a numbered marker, so keep a lookout for these distinctly shaped signposts. The Utah Beach Landing Museum is also a popular destination for veterans of D-Day and tourists alike. The panoramic view of where the American forces landed is magnificent. The beautifully preserved Sherman tank is a real treat, and the prominently displayed landing craft is a stark reminder of how uncomfortable conditions would have been out at sea for the troops embarking on the last leg of their hazardous journey. Make sure you look out for the cafe opposite the museum as well. This is a real mix of old and new, despite being built out of a typical disused German bunker. It's in fact an up-to-the-minute internet cafe with the very appropriate web address www.leroosevelt.com, in honour of the philosophical brigadier general who quite literally began the liberation of the Normandy beaches from here. Visiting Utah Beach is an exhilarating experience, and before moving along the coast in a southeasterly direction towards Omaha Beach, the second American landing point, our journey takes us to a very sobering location. This is the German cemetery at Le Combe, where a sad dignity pervades the landscape. For the French authorities, dealing with the many enemy dead was a politically delicate issue, and strict restrictions were put in place. Here the black stone crosses shadow the gravestones, each small square commemorating up to 4 men, and when you look at the dates given, you quickly realise just how young a large proportion of the German army fighting in Normandy was. The majority of those buried here fell between D-Day and August the 20th, 1944, and more than 21,000 German soldiers lie beneath this hallowed ground. It's interesting to note that victims' remains are still being found to this day beneath the Normandy countryside, and any of German origin are brought here to the Lecombe as a final resting place. The scene is dominated by Lecombe's central mound, where 207 unknown soldiers lie alongside 89 identified bodies. Teutonically solemn, the huge black cross at the summit is flanked by two figures who represent parents in mourning, and for present and future generations, whatever their nationality, this is a truly thought-provoking memorial that is far more a celebration of peace than it is a glorification of war. Our next destination leads us back to the sea, where the magnificent Ranger Memorial proudly dominates Point du Hoc, a strategic headland that on D-Day, under German control, appeared to be a significant threat to the Allied forces landing on both Utah and Omaha beaches. A daring plan employed 3 companies of the 2nd Ranger Battalion under the command of Colonel James E. Rudder. Landing on the rocky beach below Point du Hoc's 100-foot cliff face, it was the daunting task of these brave men to climb to the top and destroy the gun battery. The whole operation was certainly perilous, as the German soldiers defending this now crater-marked vantage point had ample opportunity to fire upon the ascending Americans. Of the 225 men who landed at Point du Hoc, 135 were killed, wounded, or missing in action, making for a 60% casualty rate. What made these figures even worse was the fact that Allied intelligence had been misinformed. When the surviving Rangers reached the summit, there were none of the anticipated big guns to be seen. The dreaded ordnance was hidden some distance away, unguarded in an apple orchard, and of course the guns were immediately destroyed. Today, this 30-acre site is cared for by the American Battle Monuments Commission, and apart from the construction of the Ranger Memorial, little else has been touched, giving visitors a dramatic impression of the view that met the Rangers as they scaled the steep cliffs of Point du Hoc all those years ago. If Allied intelligence is criticised with the benefit of hindsight over Point du Hoc, then it can be equally questioned about what happened here at Omaha Beach. It was believed that, although the cliffs were steep, the German soldiers defending the high ground were mainly conscripts with little military skill. But, tragically for the Americans that landed on the beach, this was far from the case. The opposition was fierce, particularly as the German 352nd Infantry Division had the good fortune to have a battalion just completing an anti-invasion exercise in the area. As the Allied landing craft came ashore, the Germans waited until the first ramps were dropped, and only then did the carnage on Omaha Beach begin. This account, prepared by the US War Department's Historical Division, eloquently sums up what happened here as the morning of D-Day dawned. Within 10 minutes of the ramps being lowered, A Company had become inert, leaderless, and almost incapable of action. Every officer and sergeant had been killed or wounded. It had become a struggle for survival and rescue. The men in the water pushed wounded men ashore ahead of them, and those who'd reached the sands crawled back into the water, pulling others to land to save them from drowning. In many cases, only to see the rescued men wounded again or to be hit themselves. Within 20 minutes of striking the beach, A Company had ceased to be an assault company and had become a forlorn little rescue party bent upon survival and the saving of lives. Looking up from the beach at Omaha to the scrub-covered steep incline which the few men to survive the landing had to then face, this is without doubt one of the most awesome reminders of the heroism and courage shown by the Allied soldiers not only on D-Day, but throughout the entire course of the war. Of all the D-Day beaches, Omaha was responsible for the heaviest casualties, 5,214 dead, missing and wounded in all. It's therefore extremely fitting that high above Omaha Beach, the beautiful American National Cemetery and Memorial stands in tribute to all the Americans who lost their lives in the battle for Normandy. The bright white marble headstones, either simple crosses or stars of David, are a striking contrast to the dark solemnity of the memorials at Lecombe. Of the 9,286 Americans buried here, 307 are unknown. However, 14,000 bodies were repatriated to the USA at the request of their families. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt is actually buried here, despite surviving the landing on Utah Beach. At the age of 57, he was the oldest officer to land on D-Day, and he died of a heart attack on the 12th of July. Next to Theodore lies the body of his brother, Quentin, an aviator who'd been killed in France during World War I, who was re-interned here to be with his kinsmen when this cemetery was built. There are 32 other pairs of brothers laid to rest side by side, and also a father and son. As our tour moves on, we come to the picturesque harbour at Port-en-Besson, which marks the division between the American beaches of Utah and Omaha and the British beaches of Gold, Juno and Sword. The Vauban Tower, dating back to 1694, managed to survive the bombardments in the aftermath of D-Day, but it is surrounded by many concrete 20th century fortifications that are much less attractive. Although tiny, this port was crucial to the Allied invasion, and by the 14th of June it was handling in excess of 1,000 tons of supplies a day, far more than it had ever done in the centuries before, or, for that matter, in the years since. From Port-en-Besson, it's just a short distance along the coast road to the Lange Battery, which is most definitely worthy of a visit. This significant vantage point was heavily fortified by the Germans, with each of these 4 concrete casements containing a 155mm rapid-firing naval gun. Today, the guns are in various states of disrepair, and it's really interesting to explore all along this ridge. The visibility out to sea is spectacular, and it'll not come as any surprise that the Allied forces were keen to quickly neutralise the enemy firepower from Lange. It took HMS Ajax some 7.5 miles out to sea, 20 minutes to silence the guns, and it's been claimed that this first bunker contains the remnants of a gun that took a direct hit right into the barrel. If you look inland from the Lange Battery, you can just make out the spires of Bayeux Cathedral, in a city famous as the home of the Great Tapestry, depicting a certain very successful French invasion back in 1066. Although we're not actually taking in Bayeux as part of our tour, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission Cemetery and Memorial here is not to be missed. There are 4,648 graves in this stunning cemetery that has a completely different character again to both its German counterpart at Le Combe and the Normandy American War Cemetery and Memorial. 9 different nationalities are represented, although with 3,935 citizens of the United Kingdom buried on this site, it's actually the largest British World War II cemetery in France. Across the now busy main road stands the Bayeux Memorial to the Missing, which was designed by Philip Hepworth. The names of 1,805 missing Commonwealth service men and women are listed and commemorated in elegant style. The Latin inscription translates as, "We, once conquered by William, have now set free the conqueror's land." A very apt remembrance in Bayeux, the first French city to be liberated by the Overlord forces. In 1940, Winston Churchill had promised the people of France that the British would not rest until the Nazi pestilence had been cleansed from Europe. He'd assured the occupied French nation that the morning would come, and on D-Day, the 6th of June, some 4 years later, Churchill's promise was honoured as the Second British Army sailed for Normandy. On a beautiful, clear, chill March morning, Colin Pomeroy walks in his father's footsteps along Gold Beach. Today, the only engine sounds to be heard belong to the ancient tractors that local fishermen are using to bring their boats up the beach. It's certainly true that time is a great healer, and although maybe a cliché, life does go on, and nowhere is that more true than here at Gold Beach. But despite the long stretches of golden sand making this a perfect holiday destination, it's impossible to miss the great concrete structures that break the surface of this morning's very calm sea. These enormous reminders of World War II are actually the remains of a major feat of engineering and daring that was instrumental in the success of the D-Day initiative. Moving up to higher ground above the lovely seaside town of Arromanches, overlooking Gold Beach, you get a much better view of the Mulberry Harbour that once stood here. In the planning of Operation Overlord, it was considered essential for both the American and British sectors to have harbours to bring in equipment and supplies as the battle for Normandy progressed. As we've already seen, Port-en-Besson, although a very good place to start, was in no way large enough to service the entire campaign. Consequently, the idea of a floating harbour was conceived, with component parts that could be towed across the English Channel to France in the immediate wake of the D-Day landings. The concept was not only inspired, but also, as all the best ideas are, wonderfully simple. Firstly, a line of old ships would be sunk along all 5 of the invasion beaches, codenamed Gooseberries, these ships providing a very basic breakwater. Then a huge semicircle of hollow concrete boxes, codenamed Phoenixes, could be towed into place and sunk to form a harbour wall, and floating roadways could be used to link the beaches with the harbour. There were 2 of these harbours, codenamed Mulberries, constructed one, as you see here, at Arromanches, to cater for the British sector, and the other at Omaha Beach, to serve the Americans' needs. Here you see all that's left of the Mulberry Harbour at Omaha, but it wasn't the Germans who were responsible for its destruction. Some 13 days after D-Day, the weather proved to be one of the Allies' major enemies. A terrific northeasterly storm smashed this Mulberry to smithereens, and the gales that ensued caused more damage in 3 days than the Germans had managed in 2 weeks. Although the Mulberry at Arromanches, nicknamed Port Winston, was battered by the storm, it remained intact, so what little could be salvaged from Omaha was taken to reinforce it. This was a setback, of course, only having 1 Mulberry rather than the planned 2, but in the circumstances, the Allies counted themselves fortunate that the Arromanches Mulberry had survived. Back down on Gold Beach, Colin has been able to find the exact spot where his father and his regiment, the Dorsets, came ashore on the morning of D-Day. Following the track up off the beach at this point is a rather pleasant detour for him, as one of the first roads that you come to is actually called Rue the Dorset Regiment, named in honour of the regiment that Colin's father had been so proud to be part of. Other roads commemorate the Hampshires and the Devonshires, and it's well worth looking out for the many road names and memorials of the D-Day landings that are certainly plentiful all along this beautiful Normandy coastline. Beyond Gold Beach, we next find Juno, where the Canadian 3rd Division had been selected to lead the assault. For many people, the images filmed on D-Day at this particular location are some of the most evocative pictures from this entire campaign, treasured by war archivists the world over. It's an interesting fact that there were at least 50 film crews recording the events of the D-Day landings, and the footage acquired can be both harrowing and uplifting by equal measure. Here you see the Canadian soldiers preparing to disembark as the ramps of the landing craft are dropped. Houses appear along the beachfront, and although the scene has of course changed in the years since D-Day, it is still possible to find the exact spot where these pictures were taken. Only the smaller of the two houses remains, still bearing the name Les Hirondelles, translated as the Swallows, tracked down for certain by the single chimney. It's quite remarkable that today we can follow in the footsteps of the Canadians as they came ashore, enabling us to step back in time and see the view that greeted them on that memorable morning. All is now peaceful, and as a rider enjoys his seaside gallop, the tranquility of this beautiful location weaves its nostalgic magic for present-day visitors and future generations, who will undoubtedly search out the D-Day landing beaches for themselves. There's no great distance between Juno and Sword Beach. By the time you reach this sector, there's little along the beach to distinguish Sword to any great degree. However, there's a fascinating story told here of bravery in the face of adversity, typical of the great British spirit that even in the darkest days of World War II refused to be crushed. Sword Beach was heavily mined and had the most concentrated landing area of all the beaches, with a 3-mile long by half-mile deep targeted shore zone. This factor, combined with a swift incoming tide on the morning of the 6th of June, meant there was considerable overcrowding as men and machinery came ashore. In such a bottleneck, casualties were high, with particularly accurate German artillery fire, and it was here, in these difficult and life-threatening conditions, that Piper Bill Millin of Lord Lovat's 1st Special Service distinguished himself in style. Fully kilted and armed with his bagpipes, Piper Millin leapt waist-deep into the water and regaled the advancing Allied troops with a rendition of Highland Laddie. From his own accounts, the beach was littered with burning tanks and fallen men, their bodies being washed on and off the beach with the ebb and flow of the tide. Still, the brave Piper played on, marching up and down the shoreline until his comrades advanced off the beach to continue their liberation of the French countryside. In fact, Piper Millin was still playing his bagpipes when Lord Lovat's troops relieved Pegasus Bridge. As our journey uncovering the history of the D-Day landing beaches comes to an end, the liberation of France and the Allied victory in World War II can be described as still being in its early stages. Cherbourg, the once great port at the northwestern end of the American landing beaches, was captured on the 27th of June in ruins. Caen, at the British eastern edge of the beaches, eventually fell to the Allies on the 9th of July, and break out from the beachhead towards the French capital Paris, and eventual victory forged ever onwards. By September the 1st, 1944, the battle for Normandy was over. This remarkable region of France had been liberated, and its inhabitants were free to rebuild their decimated towns and cities and their shattered lives. Our last destination on this tour takes us to the Merville Battery, a short distance north of Caen. This remarkable 40-acre site is a prime example of the sympathetic preservation that you'll find all over Normandy. Concrete remnants of the occupation, and one of the 4 gun casements has been transformed into a fascinating museum. Much of the material on display is of a touchingly personal nature, including letters and photographs representing all sides of the conflict. Although there's none of the sombre dignity of the German cemetery at Le Combe, or the bright shining splendour of the American cemetery high above Omaha Beach, this place is every bit a memorial to those who lost their lives in the fight for freedom. When you read the words of a French farmer's wife whose husband was shot by the Germans for allowing Allied airmen to shelter in their barn, the real implications of the battle for Normandy are made starkly clear, in a way that can be understood by every man, woman and child who comes here. Ironically, the capture of the Merville Battery was not one of the Allies' slickest operations. For Major Terence Otway and the 9th Parachute Battalion that he commanded, the strategy employed at Merville was overcomplicated and proved to be impractical. A coordinated attack by RAF Lancaster bombers failed to take out the guns, and the man-to-man combat that was required to overpower the Germans was indeed costly. 70 men were killed or wounded, reducing the battalion by almost half, leaving 80 paratroopers to complete the task. However, despite little at Merville going to plan, the bravery and resourcefulness of Major Otway and his men certainly saved the day, and they are all remembered as heroes. It's often been said that the difference between the Allied troops and their German counterparts was most evident when the men needed to think for themselves. Hitler and his commanders' dictatorial style of leadership left little room for initiative, and events such as the storming of the Merville Battery, when the Allied soldiers were literally forced to think on their feet, turned the tide of the war, and more importantly, the course of history. And so our story comes to a very thought-provoking close. Hopefully, this tour of the D-Day landing beaches, devised by squadron leader Colin Pomeroy, has captured the true atmosphere of a June morning back in 1944 that significantly affected the lives of us all. Normandy today has much to teach its many visitors, and it truly has been a privilege to walk in the footsteps of the brave souls who risked everything to free France from tyranny and ensure that for all mankind the world could be a better place.